The prairie had a way of swallowing sound, leaving only the creak of wood in the wind or the low cry of a hawk circling above. She had grown used to that silence, to the long days where the only company was the crackle of her fire or the steady beat of her own heart. Out here, a woman learned to be her own guard, her own comfort, her own healer. She knew how to mend a fence, how to set a broken bone, how to keep wolves away with a single shot from the rifle above her door. But none of that prepared her for what she saw that day on the edge of the cottonwoods. At first, she thought it was just another trick of the light, something moving low to the ground, something broken. She squinted against the sun and stepped forward, her hands tightening on her apron. Then she saw him, a man sprawled in the dirt, his chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. His skin was marked with paint, his hair bound in braids, his shirt torn and soaked dark with blood. She knew instantly what he was, a Comanche, and she knew just as quickly what it meant. The settlers whispered about Comanche raids, about burning farms and vanishing families. Fear of them stretched as wide as the plains. To shelter, one was unthinkable. To even draw close was to risk being marked an enemy by her own people. She could have turned away. She could have let the sun finish what the posse had started. No one would have known and no one would have blamed her. But as she stood there, the man's eyes flickered open, dark and desperate, and in them she saw not the terror from the stories but the raw, simple will to live. Her chest tightened. She looked back toward her cabin, the safety of its walls. Then back at him, his lips cracked, his body trembling. She could already hear the echo of hooves somewhere in the distance. The posse, still hunting, still eager to finish the kill. Her pulse hammered in her ears as she made the choice. She bent down, slid her arm beneath his shoulder and whispered words he could not understand. "Come on, I won't leave you here." The silence of the prairie seemed to shift. The wind carried the smell of smoke, the sound of riders drawing closer, and her own breath quickened. She had crossed a line, one she could never step back from, and in that moment she knew life at her little cabin would never be the same again. She half dragged and half carried him through the tall grass, her body straining against his weight. Every step felt like a mile, her arms trembling as she fought to keep him upright. The man's breaths were shallow, ragged, and every time she thought he might collapse for good, he forced one more step. She pushed the door of her cabin open with her shoulder and guided him inside, lowering him carefully onto the narrow cot by the wall. His blood had already soaked through her apron, staining it dark, and she pressed her hand against his chest as if that might hold the life inside him. Her cabin was simple, just one room with a stove in the corner, shelves lined with jars, and a table scarred from years of use. It had been her sanctuary, a place where she controlled every inch, where she decided who came and who went. But as she stood over him, that control slipped away. The world outside did not know that a wounded Comanche now lay on her bed. If they found out, no excuse would save her. She would be branded a traitor. Worse still, she might draw the vengeance of those who already hated his people. She found herself working without thinking. Her hands dipped into the tin basin, filling it with water, tearing strips from an old sheet to make bandages. She had tended to cuts before, to burns, even to a broken arm once, but this was different. The wound in his side was deep, a gash torn wide by bullet or blade, and when she pressed the cloth against it, his body jerked violently. He groaned in his own tongue, words she couldn't understand, but she didn't need to. Pain sounded the same in every language. Her heart pounded as she cleaned the wound. Every time she lifted the cloth, fresh blood welled up, and she fought the rising fear that he would die before dawn. "Stay with me," she muttered, though she knew he could not understand. "You have to hold on." Outside, the wind shifted. She froze, cloth still pressed against his chest, listening. Hooves, distant but growing closer. She moved quickly to the window, peeking through the small slit between the shutters. Riders moved along the ridge beyond the creek, their figures small in the fading light. The posse. They hadn't given up the hunt. Her throat tightened. If they turned toward her cabin, if they knocked on her door, there would be no way to hide him. She looked back at the man on the bed. His eyes were closed again, his breath ragged, but one of his hands clutched the blanket as if he were still fighting to hold on. She thought of the settlers in town, their stories of Comanche raids. She thought of the posse outside, men she had seen laughing by the fire, drinking hard, spitting their hatred into the dust. She thought of what they would do to her if they knew who lay inside her cabin. The riders passed. The sound of hooves grew faint, fading into the distance until only silence filled the night once more. She exhaled slowly, pressing her back against the wall, but the reprieve was fragile. They would circle back. They always did. She returned to him, sitting on the edge of the cot. His skin burned hot beneath her hand, fever rising fast. She lifted his head gently, pressing a spoon of water to his lips, watching as he swallowed with difficulty. His eyes flickered open again, meeting hers. For a moment the world fell quiet. No words, just the look of a man clinging to life and a woman who had chosen, against reason, to help him. That night stretched endlessly. She tended the fire, boiling water, changing the bandages again and again. Every groan from him, every twitch of his hand reminded her of the risk she carried. She thought of her father, who had taught her to work the land, who had told her to stay away from Comanche country. She thought of her mother, who had whispered prayers each night for protection. What would they say now, seeing her kneel beside this man? Would they call her foolish? Would they call her lost? Or would they see what she saw, that sometimes mercy mattered more than fear? The hours crawled by. The cabin filled with the smell of smoke and blood, the crackle of the stove the only steady sound. She forced herself to keep working, even when exhaustion tugged at her eyelids, even when her body begged for rest. Each time his breathing faltered, she leaned closer, willing him to survive. She told herself it was because she could not stand to see death inside her home. But somewhere deeper, she knew it was because she could not bear to let compassion be swallowed by hatred. Near dawn, she stepped outside for a moment, the air cool against her face. The prairie stretched wide and empty, the sky painted with streaks of gray and pink. Her eyes swept the horizon, searching for movement, for riders, for any sign that the posse had returned. Nothing, only silence. She returned to the cabin and found him awake. His gaze followed her as she crossed the room, his dark eyes clear for the first time since she had found him. He said something, his voice low, words in a language she did not know, but she understood the way he looked at her. It was not thanks, not yet, but recognition. She had not let him die. She sat back down beside him, dipping the cloth in water once more, pressing it gently to his forehead. His strength was thin, but his spirit was still there, unbroken. She realized then that saving him had not only changed his fate, it had changed hers too. For better or worse, her life was no longer her own. The first light of morning slipped through the window, casting soft gold across the floor. The cabin felt smaller now, heavy with the weight of what she had done. She knew the sun would bring new dangers, that the men who hunted him might return, that his people might soon come searching as well. She brushed the thought aside, focusing on the moment before her. One man, one wound, one fragile breath after another. For now, that was enough. The sun rose slow and heavy, spilling light across the prairie until the whole horizon seemed to glow. She stood at the window, her hands gripping the frame, eyes fixed on the open land beyond. The man still lay on the cot behind her, his breaths deeper now but still uneven. His fever had broken sometime before dawn, leaving his face damp with sweat. She had done what she could with the herbs and cloth she had, but she knew his strength would not return in a single night. Her stomach twisted with worry. Saving him had been an act she couldn't take back, and now every sound carried a weight it hadn't before. The creak of a branch, the call of a crow, the distant rumble of hooves, all of it made her blood run cold. She had lived with fear before, fear of wolves, of drought, of storms rolling down from the mountains. But this was different. This fear was human, sharp and unpredictable, and it pressed against her chest with every breath. She turned back to him, studying his face in the morning light. The paint on his skin had faded, smeared by sweat and blood, but the lines were still there. Marks of his people, marks that would condemn her if anyone saw him here. His chest rose and fell in shallow rhythm, his hand resting loosely over the blanket she had tucked around him. He looked less like the stories told in town and more like any man broken by violence, caught between life and death. She busied herself with work to steady her thoughts. Water was fetched, the stove stoked, bread dough set to rise. She moved through the cabin with deliberate purpose, but her eyes kept flicking back to him, searching for signs of change. Every time he stirred, she felt her heart jump. She wondered what he thought of her, if he thought of her at all, or if he simply saw another enemy delaying the end. By midday, he opened his eyes again. This time, they lingered on her, steady and unflinching. She froze with the basin in her hands, meeting his gaze. For a moment, the silence was thick, filled with questions neither could speak. Then he tried to sit up, grimacing as the movement tore at his wound. She rushed forward, pressing a hand to his shoulder. "No, you'll tear it open again." He could not understand her words, but he understood her touch. His body eased back against the cot, though his eyes never left hers. She offered him water, lifting the cup to his lips. He drank slowly, each swallow measured, then let his head fall back. When she drew the blanket up around him, he said something in his language, low and rough. She could not make sense of the syllables, but there was no anger in them. She wondered if it was thanks. She wondered if it mattered. The hours dragged as she kept watch. Once, she stepped outside to gather wood, her eyes scanning the horizon with every step. The sky stretched endlessly, the land rolling wide and empty, yet she could not shake the feeling of being watched. The posse was out there somewhere. His people too. She imagined them both, one hunting to finish the kill, the other searching to reclaim their own. And she caught between them, holding a secret that could bring either mercy or destruction. By evening, the wind shifted again. She heard it before she saw it, the distant thunder of hooves. Her heart seized, and she rushed to the window, peering through the shutters. Dust rose far across the plains, curling into the sky in long trails. Riders. Not a handful this time, but dozens, spread wide like a dark wave rolling toward her. She stepped back, her breath quick and shallow. She turned to the man on the cot. His eyes were open now, sharper, aware. He heard it too. He pushed against the blanket, trying once more to rise. She reached his side, pressing him down, shaking her head. But he resisted, his hand catching her wrist. His grip was weak, yet his gaze burned with urgency. He said something again, more forceful this time, his words spilling into the room. She could not understand, but the meaning pressed against her all the same. They were his people. Her body trembled as she stood there, caught between panic and disbelief. The dust cloud drew closer, the sound of hooves swelling until the walls seemed to shake with it. She moved to the door, bracing herself, her rifle heavy in her hands. Through the crack in the shutter she saw them, Comanche riders painted and fierce, their horses kicking up dust, circling like hawks around prey. They had come not in silence but with the weight of thunder. The cabin was surrounded. Her breath came quick, her heart hammering in her chest. She thought of running, but there was nowhere to go. She thought of hiding him, but there was no corner of the cabin that could shield him from so many. She thought of the choice she had made the night before, and how it had led her here. The man struggled again, forcing himself upright with a grimace. His strength was thin, but his will was unshaken. He looked at her, his eyes hard with something that was not anger but resolve. He motioned weakly toward the door, then pressed his hand against his chest, as if to say, "Let me face them." She stood frozen, torn between fear and trust. The riders outside shouted, their voices sharp and commanding. Horses snorted and stamped against the earth. Spears and rifles glinted in the fading light. Every instinct told her to bolt the door, to raise her gun, to fight if she must. But another voice, quieter yet stronger, reminded her of the night before. Of the moment she had bent down in the dirt and chosen mercy. Her hand trembled on the rifle. She stepped toward the bed, looking at him one last time. His face was pale, his body weak, yet his eyes burned with a fire she could not deny. He had warriors outside, men who might kill her without hesitation. But he was still here alive because she had made a choice. The ground shook as the riders drew tighter, circling the cabin in a storm of dust and hooves. She felt the walls tremble, the roof quiver with the sound. Her breath caught, her pulse quickened, and the truth settled heavy in her chest. The night before she had saved one life. Now, standing in the middle of her small cabin, she wondered if that one act of mercy would be the very thing that ended hers. The sound of hooves grew louder until it seemed the earth itself was shaking beneath her cabin. Dust filled the air outside, turning the last glow of the setting sun into a haze of gold and red. She stood frozen by the door, the rifle clutched tight in her hands, her breath shallow. The children of the prairie had come in force, and their circle around her small homestead felt like a tightening noose. The Comanche riders slowed, their horses pacing in steady rhythm, eyes fixed on her cabin as though it were prey. She could hear their voices, sharp calls that rose and fell, words she could not understand but whose meaning carried clear enough. They had found their missing warrior, and now they wanted answers. Behind her, the man she had saved was trying once more to rise. His body trembled with the effort, the wound in his side reopening with each movement, but his will was stronger than the pain. She rushed to him, pressing him back, whispering, "You'll kill yourself." But he only shook his head, his dark eyes fierce, his hand gripping her arm. He spoke again in his language, short and urgent, pointing toward the door. Her pulse hammered. If she let him go outside in this state, what would happen? Would his people see her as savior or enemy? Would they burn her home to ash before hearing a single word? Every story she had ever heard in town filled her mind. The warnings, the fears, the tales of raids that ended in blood. Yet none of those stories had prepared her for the reality of this moment, where the life of one man tied her fate to the judgment of many. A heavy knock struck the door, so hard the wood rattled. She gasped, gripping the rifle tighter, her eyes darting to the bed. He pushed himself higher, teeth clenched, sweat streaking his brow. He motioned again, firm, insistent, his gaze never leaving hers. For the first time she understood something without words. He was not asking permission. He was telling her, "Let me face them." Her throat tightened, but she lowered the rifle. She stepped to his side, slipped an arm beneath his, and together they staggered toward the door. His weight pressed heavy against her, his body weak but his spirit unbroken. Another pounding struck the wood, the sound echoing through her bones. With trembling hands, she pulled the latch and opened the door. The world outside erupted in motion. Riders pulled their horses to sudden stillness, dust swirling around them like smoke. Dozens of eyes turned toward her, hard and unblinking, their spears and rifles glinting in the dying light. She felt the weight of their judgment pressing down, 1,000 unspoken questions hanging in the silence. The man leaned heavily against her, his breath ragged, but when he stepped forward the riders stirred. Their voices rose, calling his name, relief breaking through their suspicion. He lifted his arm, his voice low but strong, speaking to them in words that carried conviction even through weakness. They fell silent, listening. She stood beside him, her heart racing, her hands still trembling from the weight of the rifle she no longer held. She could not understand his words, but she could feel their meaning in the shift of the riders' faces. Anger softened to curiosity. Suspicion turned to stillness. The man pointed once toward his wound, then toward her, his voice unwavering. A murmur rippled through the warriors. Some frowned, their brows furrowed, while others nodded slowly. The silence that followed was heavier than the storm of hooves that had surrounded her home. She felt their eyes on her, studying her with the intensity of hawks circling prey. She stood tall, though her legs trembled, meeting their gaze with as much steadiness as she could muster. For a long moment, no one moved. The man leaned harder into her, his body weakening again, but his voice did not falter. He spoke one final phrase, his tone filled with something fierce and undeniable. Then he lowered his arm, his strength spent, and she caught him before he fell. The riders shifted. One dismounted, stepping forward, his face solemn but not hostile. He bent down, examined the wound, then looked up at her with eyes that searched for truth. His gaze lingered, heavy but not cruel, before he rose again and gave a sharp command. The others lowered their weapons. Relief surged through her, so powerful her knees nearly gave way. The storm that had threatened to break upon her had passed, though the air was still thick with tension. The Comanche did not ride away. They did not leave her in peace. But their weapons no longer pointed at her door. She guided the wounded man back inside, laying him gently on the cot once more. The riders remained outside, their silhouettes framed in the window, their presence a reminder of how fragile her safety had become. She sank to the floor beside the bed, pressing her hands against her face, her breath trembling with the weight of it all. The man opened his eyes again, weak but steady. He looked at her, his gaze softer now, as if to say she had done more than save his life. She had faced his people and stood unbroken. She had chosen mercy in a world where fear ruled. The sound of horses shifted outside, the warriors speaking low to one another, their voices carried by the evening wind. She did not know what they would decide, whether they would claim him, leave him, or drag her into a world she had never touched before. But as she sat there, the golden light fading into night, she knew one thing with absolute certainty. Her act of compassion had bound her fate to his, and nothing in her life would ever be simple again. The night pressed down heavy on the prairie, the air thick with the scent of smoke and dust. Outside her cabin, the warriors still lingered, their horses shifting restlessly, their voices carrying low across the yard. The glow of their campfires painted moving shadows on the cabin walls, and every flicker reminded her that she was no longer alone in the wilderness. She sat on the floor near the cot, her back against the rough logs, her rifle leaning against her knee, watching the man she had saved drift in and out of restless sleep. Every groan he made tore at her nerves, but she did not leave his side. She kept a basin close, fresh water drawn from the creek, cloths damp and ready. The fever threatened to rise again, and each time his skin grew too hot beneath her hand, fear wrapped itself tighter around her chest. She whispered to herself more than to him, small words of encouragement she hoped carried across the divide of language. Her voice was steady, though her heart quivered with doubt. Through the shutter, she caught glimpses of the riders. They did not sleep as settlers did. They moved like sentinels, pacing the edges of her land, eyes sharp, their presence a reminder that her act of mercy had drawn her into their gaze. She wondered what they thought of her, a fool perhaps, or worse, a thief who had claimed one of their own. She could almost hear the judgment of her own people too, should they ever learn what she had done. In both worlds, she risked being branded as traitor. Hours passed in silence, broken only by the sound of firewood cracking in the stove and the low murmur of horses outside. She found herself studying his face in the glow of the flames. Even in weakness, there was strength there, the sharp lines of his jaw, the determination that refused to bend even when his body betrayed him. She thought of the moment he had spoken for her, standing before his warriors, his words carrying weight she could only feel but not understand. He had not let them harm her. That truth pressed against her heart in ways she was not ready to name. Sometime near midnight, the door creaked open. She jumped, rifle in hand, her breath caught tight in her throat. A tall figure filled the doorway, a warrior with long braids and stern eyes. He did not raise a weapon. Instead, he stepped inside slowly, nodding once toward the man on the cot. His expression was unreadable, but his intent was clear. He had come to see if the words spoken earlier were true. The cabin felt smaller with him inside, the weight of his presence crowding her every breath. He crouched beside the bed, examining the wound with practiced eyes, then looked at her. For a long moment the silence burned until he gave a single nod. Respect, acknowledgement, something between the two. Without a word he stood and left again, his shadow swallowed by the firelight outside. Her body trembled with the release of fear, but the meaning lingered. They would not kill her tonight. They would not burn her home, but neither were they gone. They were waiting, watching. As the night stretched on, she thought of her parents, of the little church in town where voices often rose in warnings about the Comanche. She thought of how they would recoil at the sight of her now, kneeling in a cabin filled with the breath of a wounded warrior, surrounded by his people. The girl they had raised to obey, to fear, to keep her distance, had stepped across a line she could never uncross. And yet she felt no regret. Fear, yes, but not regret. The man stirred again, his lips moving in words too faint to catch. She leaned closer, catching the sound of syllables foreign yet heavy with intent. His hand reached weakly toward hers, an instinct made her take it. His skin was hot, rough with calluses, but his grip carried a spark of the same strength she had seen when he faced his people. For a moment, the fear and uncertainty faded, replaced by something quieter, a recognition that the bond between them was no longer just chance. The hours crept toward dawn. The fire burned low, shadows stretching across the room as the first pale light crept through the window. She rose, stiff and tired, to stoke the embers, her hands steady despite the ache in her bones. Outside, the riders stirred as well, their voices rising with the morning. She heard the soft bray of horses, the shifting of saddles, the language of a people she could not understand but whose presence she could not deny. When she returned to the bed, his eyes were open again, clearer this time. He looked at her with a steadiness that felt heavier than words. He said something softly, his voice barely more than a whisper, but his eyes never left hers. She could not translate it, but she understood enough. He was alive because of her. The weight of that truth pressed deeper as the morning grew brighter. She felt it in every glance through the window, in every sound of hooves shifting in the dirt outside. The line between her world and his had blurred, and now she stood in the space between, unsure which side would claim her. She did not know if the warriors outside would ride away or if they would demand more. She did not know if the town would ever forgive her if they learned. But as she looked down at him, his strength slowly returning, his people waiting beyond her door, one truth became clear in her heart. She had made a choice born not of fear but of mercy, and though it had brought the world to her doorstep, she would not take it back. The cabin was no longer just hers. It was a place where two paths had crossed, where one act of compassion had turned into a bond no posse could erase, no warrior could deny. The day ahead would bring answers, or more danger. But for now, in the hush of dawn, she sat beside him, listening to his breath steady, her hand resting against the rough wood of the bedpost, waiting for whatever came next. The morning light spread slowly across the plains, turning the dust and grass outside into a sea of gold. She stood at the window, her hands pressed against the frame, watching the Comanche warriors gathered beyond the yard. Their horses shifted and pawed at the ground, their silhouettes outlined against the rising sun. They had not left in the night as she had hoped. Instead, they had camped there, waiting, their watchful eyes fixed on her cabin. Inside, the air was heavy with smoke from the stove and the faint, sharp smell of dried blood. The man she had saved lay quiet, his breathing steadier now, but his strength still fragile. His eyes opened at intervals, dark and alert, following her whenever she moved across the room. He said little, only short words in his own tongue, but the way he looked at her carried meaning she could not ignore. He was alive, and they both knew it was because she had chosen mercy when she could have turned away. The days stretched forward with unbearable slowness. She busied herself with small tasks, mending, sweeping, fetching water, though her hands trembled as she worked. Every time she stepped outside for wood or to draw from the creek, she felt their eyes on her. The warriors watched without speaking, their expressions unreadable, their presence as constant as the wind. She carried the buckets back into the cabin, her heart pounding, feeling like she was walking a tightrope suspended between two worlds. By midday she heard movement at the door. Her hand shot to the rifle, but before she could raise it, the door swung open. A warrior entered, tall and stern, his braids falling over his shoulders. He looked first at her, then at the man on the cot. They spoke in their language, a low exchange she could not understand. The wounded man's voice was weak but firm, and when he gestured toward her, the visitor's eyes shifted back. His gaze lingered on her face for a long, heavy moment, then softened almost imperceptibly. With a sharp nod, he turned and left. She released a breath she had not realized she was holding. The man sank back against the cot, exhausted from the effort, but his eyes carried a calm she had not seen before. She felt the tremor in her hands ease just slightly, though the tension in her chest did not fade. The warriors outside were still there. They had not decided what to do with her. As the afternoon waned, the silence of the cabin grew thick. She sat beside the cot, dipping a cloth in water, pressing it to his forehead. Her voice broke the silence, soft and steady, though she knew he did not understand. "I don't know what happens now. I don't know if they'll let me live, but I couldn't leave you. I just couldn't." His gaze followed her as she spoke, his hand shifting weakly, brushing against hers. It was not a grasp, not yet, but the faintest touch of acknowledgement. She swallowed hard, blinking back the sting in her eyes. In that quiet gesture, she felt more gratitude than any word could have given. Toward evening, the sound of drums carried faintly across the prairie. The warriors had gathered in a circle, their voices rising in a chant that sent shivers down her spine. She could not see their faces from the window, but she could feel the weight of their ritual, the unity in their voices. The sound rolled through the air, steady and unrelenting, filling her cabin with vibrations that made her bones ache. She glanced at the man on the bed, but his eyes were closed, his face calm, as though the sound was a balm rather than a threat. She turned back to the window, clutching the sill so tightly her knuckles whitened. She thought of the townspeople, of what they would say if they saw her now, alone in a cabin, surrounded by those they called enemies, cradling the life of one who should have been left to die. She thought of the posse still out there, perhaps searching, perhaps ready to ride again. Between two worlds she had no place in either, and yet here she stood, her heart refusing to bow to fear. As the sun sank low, the warriors returned to their horses. One by one they mounted, their voices carrying through the air in sharp commands. She braced herself, her heart pounding. This was the moment she had dreaded, the decision that would seal her fate. Would they burn her home? Would they take her away into a world she could not survive? She pressed her hand against the doorframe, steadying herself for whatever came. The riders did not advance. Instead, the one who had entered her cabin earlier rode forward, his horse stopping just outside the door. He raised his hand, palm outward, a gesture of acknowledgement that needed no translation. His voice called out a phrase, strong and clear, directed at the man inside. The wounded warrior answered from his cot, his voice carrying with surprising strength. The rider nodded once, then wheeled his horse around. Slowly the others followed. The sound of hooves rose again, but this time it moved away from the cabin, spreading out across the plains until the dust faded and the prairie fell silent once more. She stood frozen in the doorway, watching them vanish into the horizon. The land was wide and empty again, the silence returning with the weight of all that had passed. Her breath trembled, her hands gripping the frame so tightly she could feel the wood splinter beneath her fingers. Inside, the man rested quietly, his strength slowly returning, his people gone but not without leaving their mark. She turned to him, her heart still racing, and saw his eyes open once more. He did not speak, but the look he gave her carried everything she needed to know. He had not been abandoned. Neither had she. The prairie night crept in, cool and vast, the stars beginning to rise one by one above the endless horizon. She sat down beside the cot, her body heavy with exhaustion, her spirit still trembling with the enormity of what had unfolded. She had stepped into a story that could never be untangled, a path that would forever bind her to the choice she had made. And as the fire crackled softly in the stove, she knew the world beyond her cabin door would never look the same again.